There's someone in your life who has been carrying something so deep in their heart that they've never felt safe enough to let it see daylight. This weight has been there far longer than you probably realize. It's been sitting beneath the surface for what feels like forever to them. They didn't wake up one morning and suddenly stop feeling what they felt. The feelings didn't just evaporate like morning fog. What actually happened was so gradual, so silent, that nobody watching from the outside would have known it was even occurring. What they did was push those real feelings down into a place where they couldn't see them, couldn't examine them, couldn't be hurt by them anymore. They buried everything carefully. They constructed walls. They told themselves that not speaking about it would be easier, that silence was the path of least resistance. But here's the thing about emotions that get shoved into the darkness. They don't disappear. They sit there, getting heavier, accumulating weight like sediment at the bottom of a river. Day after day, week after week, month after month, they grow denser. They wait. And then one day, without warning, all of that accumulated heaviness rises up at once, demanding to be acknowledged. That's where this message is coming from right now. It's not coming from a place of strength or peace or confidence. It's coming from fear. It's coming from uncertainty. It's coming from the crushing realization that time may have already slipped away, that waiting has had a cost, and that moment might have already passed. Something shifted inside them recently. Something undeniable. Maybe they encountered something that brought you into their mind unexpectedly. Maybe they heard your name in a conversation and it jolted them awake. Maybe life finally got quiet enough that the truth they'd been drowning out with noise suddenly became impossible to ignore. Whatever opened the door, it shook them out of the place where they'd been hiding. A single thought landed on them with full force. They might lose you in a way that can't be fixed later. This realization didn't arrive gently at all. It didn't show up during a busy afternoon when they could brush it aside and keep moving. It came during the quiet hours of the night when everything feels heavy and still. It appeared when their phone sat silent. It showed up when being around other people started to feel hollow instead of meaningful. When all the noise finally faded away and they were left with themselves, the silence started asking questions they couldn't run from anymore. They reached a point where looking away became impossible. That's when they were forced to confront what they've been avoiding. Nobody else carries what you carry inside your heart. Nobody else listens the way you do, with that kind of patience that doesn't feel like work. Nobody else understands them without needing endless explanations and justifications. Nobody else offered them comfort in that balanced way, supporting without controlling, caring without suffocating. The moment they recognized that truth, something started building inside them. A sense of urgency, a pressure that's been growing ever since. But here's the part that matters. This urgency isn't purely about love. It's also about fear. It's about the terror of losing something they now understand they can't replace. If they could be completely honest with you right now, without their ego getting in the way, without fear making them construct excuses, they would probably say something like this. They should have done more. They should have acted sooner. They believed they had more time than they actually did. They assumed your care and understanding would just be there indefinitely, that your patience was infinite. What they didn't understand was that silence has consequences too. It wounds. It creates distance. It changes things. They're beginning to realize that doing nothing is still a choice, and every choice creates an outcome. Their choice to stay silent came with a real cost. It affected the closeness that used to exist between you. They carry guilt now. Guilt for not being there when they should have been. Guilt for choosing quiet when honesty was what the moment needed. Guilt for lacking the courage to speak up when it might have actually mattered. At the time, distance felt safer. Silence felt easier. Avoidance felt more manageable. It gave them the illusion of control. But pretending difficult emotions don't exist doesn't protect anyone from what happens because of them. It just delays it. It lets the consequences grow stronger over time. This person doesn't struggle because they feel too little. They struggle because they feel far too much and have no idea how to handle it. Opening their heart to you would have meant accepting uncertainty. It would have meant risking rejection. It would have meant looking at parts of themselves they weren't ready to examine. There's a saying that the patterns hidden deep in the darkness will keep directing your life from the shadows until you bring them into the light. That's pretty much what happened here. Instead of listening to what their heart was trying to communicate, they let fear make all the decisions. They let pride speak louder than the truth. They let silence speak louder than anything else. Now those choices have transformed into consequences they can no longer overlook. There's another part of this that weighs on them constantly. They can feel that you're not the same person you used to be. Your energy has shifted. Something about your presence feels different. The tone of your responses has changed. Even your silence feels different now. You might still care about them. You might still hold feelings connected to what you shared, but you're not chasing anything anymore. You're not searching for explanations. You're not repeating yourself, hoping they'll finally understand. You've stepped out of that painful place where confusion was everywhere and uncertainty defined every moment. You've moved beyond it. This transformation unsettles them more than they expected because they depended on your patience far more than they ever admitted. They leaned on your understanding. They relied on your kindness. They took for granted your willingness to stay while they kept their own heart locked away behind walls they rarely let down. Deep down, they assumed you would always be there, patient, understanding, accepting, forgiving. They never actually imagined you would reach a point where you chose yourself. But you did, and they feel that shift with absolute clarity now. That quiet choice you made speaks louder than any argument ever could. Arguments still carry attachment. Arguments still show emotional investment. Arguments still prove someone is fighting to be heard. But your calmness now feels different. Your calmness feels like acceptance, and that possibility forces them to face something they've never wanted to acknowledge. The possibility that your life will just continue forward without them. For so long they believed there would always be another chance, another conversation, another moment to say what needed to be said, another opportunity to finally explain themselves. Now they're not sure those chances still exist. That uncertainty follows them everywhere. It appears during quiet evenings. It shows up when they see something that reminds them of you. It arrives when memories surface unexpectedly and bring feelings they thought had disappeared. The memories aren't dramatic or intense. Most of them are surprisingly ordinary. A conversation, a shared laugh, something you said, a moment of simple understanding. But those memories carry weight because they remind them of something rare, being seen, feeling understood, experiencing a connection that never really left their heart, no matter how hard they tried to convince themselves otherwise. Now they're caught between two intense emotions, regret for what wasn't done and fear of what might never come back. Neither feeling lets them have much peace, neither allows them to rest. Part of them wants to reach out right now and say everything. Part of them is terrified of how you'll respond, terrified that too much time has passed, terrified that the person you've become is beyond the place where they left things unresolved. But the truth keeps pressing against the walls they built around themselves. The truth keeps insisting on being acknowledged. The truth keeps demanding honesty. Because some connections leave an imprint that doesn't just fade through distance or silence. Some people stay present in the heart, even when they're absent from your everyday life. And whether they're ready to admit it openly or not, that's the reality they're facing now. For the first time in a long while, they're not focused on protecting themselves from painful emotions. They're being forced to examine the cost of their silence. They're being forced to look honestly at what fear has taken from them. And maybe most importantly, they're being forced to recognize the value of what they had before they took it for granted. That realization is heavy, and once certain truths become impossible to ignore, life rarely lets you go back to pretending they don't exist. Pay close attention now, because this is where things become even more direct. What they're afraid of losing isn't just you as a person in their life. They're afraid of losing something rare, the experience of being truly seen without harsh judgment. They fear losing the emotional safety they never fully admitted they depended on. They fear losing that uncommon space where they could feel understood without being pressured beyond their boundaries before they were ready. Only now are they beginning to understand that not every bond can be repaired once it's allowed to fall apart. Not every meaningful connection can just be replaced by someone new who comes along later. Some people leave an impact that can't be recreated, no matter how hard someone tries. This realization stays with them constantly. It appears during quiet moments when there's nothing left to distract them from what they're carrying. It rises when they try to move forward but can't find solid emotional ground. It returns every time they compare another person to you and immediately see a difference they can't explain away. That's why the urgency inside them keeps getting stronger with each passing day. It's not about trying to control you or reclaim some kind of influence. It comes from the understanding that time isn't something they have in endless supply anymore. They can feel a door slowly closing, not dramatically, not with anger or big declarations. It's happening quietly in the background, almost unnoticed. But that kind of quiet closing is often the most serious. When a door closes gently in someone's heart, it rarely opens again without effort. They want to reach out to you now. They want to find the right words. They want to explain themselves honestly. They want to offer an apology that actually means something instead of sounding hollow or defensive. But fear interrupts every attempt before it can fully start. Fear keeps asking if it's already too late. Fear keeps suggesting that maybe you don't care the way you used to. Fear keeps reminding them that showing their true self could lead to rejection. That cuts deeply. Because of it, they hesitate. They hold their words back. They create messages in their mind and then delete them before sending. They imagine conversations from start to finish that never actually happen. They examine every possible outcome they can think of and still end up exactly where they started. While they keep delaying, the pressure keeps building inside with nowhere to release. This isn't a promise that everything between you will suddenly resolve. This isn't a comforting fairy tale. This isn't a guarantee about the future. It's closer to an honest confession spoken across time and distance. They're not claiming all the damage has already been repaired. They're not pretending they suddenly found all the missing answers. What they're finally admitting, even if only in their private thoughts, is that treating you like you would always be there waiting was unfair. They failed to recognize your true value until they felt the emptiness of your absence. When truth arrives this late, it brings extra pain because it comes with the realization that something deeply important may have already slipped away. But here's what matters for you more than what it means for them. And pay attention to this part carefully. This is not encouraging you to stand still and wait. It's not asking you to forgive before you genuinely feel ready. It's not asking you to go back into the same uncertainty and pain you've already experienced. It's simply revealing the truth they failed to communicate through their actions. You mattered to them far more than they ever knew how to express. Your absence is louder in their life now than your presence ever seemed when you were there every day. What existed between you was real, even if they handled it poorly. The true power in this situation belongs entirely to you and whatever decision you choose to make next. Real power doesn't rush forward just because someone else suddenly feels desperate. Strong desperation doesn't automatically mean genuine readiness for change. A person can feel overwhelming regret and still not be capable of offering the consistent care and emotional responsibility that a meaningful relationship actually requires. Right now, this person is sitting with the honest consequences of who they chose to be when it mattered most. Consequences reveal truth clearly. They strip away comforting stories. They remove excuses. They expose what silence truly cost everyone involved. They've been revisiting old memories recently, memories they once thought were too insignificant to matter. Now they see those same moments through the lens of loss rather than the comfort of being right. They remember the small things you did without expecting anything in return. They remember how you checked on them for no particular reason. They remember how you could sense their mood before they even said a word. They remember how you held yourself together even when they unexpectedly pulled away. They remember how you consistently moved toward understanding instead of rushing toward blame or anger. Those memories are heavy on them because they reveal something difficult to accept. You met them at an emotional depth they hadn't yet reached within themselves. At the time, they withdrew from the growth and responsibility that meaningful connections require. For a long period, they convinced themselves that distance was protection. Now, that same distance feels far less like safety and much more like exposure. Even through the silence that exists now, they still feel seen by you. But your silence has changed. What once felt temporary now feels permanent. What once felt like a pause now feels like genuine distance. What once suggested another conversation might happen soon now feels like life continuing without any clear expectation of your return. That difference affects them more than they would ever admit out loud. They can sense that you're no longer building your emotional world around their uncertainty. You're no longer waiting for them to reach the place where you've already been standing. You're no longer arranging your life around their mixed signals or confusion. That realization awakens an even deeper fear. Not just the fear that you might reject them if they reach out, but the fear that they may no longer hold the same meaningful place in your life that they once did. They worry that you've quietly closed the chapter without anger, without confrontation, and without needing any final explanation. That kind of calm can be frightening to someone who became accustomed to your availability, especially when they relied on it without truly earning it. Another important realization is taking shape inside them now. You never expected perfection from them. You never demanded they become flawless. You never asked them to have all the answers. You simply wanted them to show up when it mattered. You wanted honesty instead of avoidance. You wanted effort instead of silence. You wanted genuine emotion instead of walls. You weren't asking for impossible standards. You were asking for presence. You were asking for truth. You were asking for consistency. Only now are they beginning to understand what that actually means. And that understanding carries weight that grows heavier every day they look back at what could have been different. You wanted steady consistency. You were never asking them to completely reinvent themselves or become someone different at their core. What you truly wanted was for them to live according to the values and qualities they often talk about having. Now they can see with uncomfortable clarity how many times they chose comfort when courage was what the moment actually needed. They repeatedly told themselves they weren't ready yet. They created reasons for their silence and explanations for their distance. They found justifications for why the timing never seemed quite right. But readiness doesn't just appear one day on its own. It doesn't arrive when life becomes convenient. Readiness is a choice that has to be made deliberately and acted upon. When you offered honesty, love, and genuine presence, they didn't fully meet you there. They held part of themselves back. They remained guarded when openness was needed. That realization hurts now because the opportunity doesn't feel the same anymore. They can sense the change in you clearly. It shows in your voice. It appears in how quickly you respond. It reveals itself in the fact that you no longer work so hard to prove your value to them. It lives in the quiet confidence that has settled where desperation and reaching once existed. That shift changes everything about the situation. For a long time, they believed they had endless time because you consistently showed patience and understanding. They confused your patience with permanent availability. They interpreted your care as a promise that you would always be waiting on their timeline. What they forgot was that patience has limits. Eventually self-respect rises. Eventually clarity arrives. Eventually a person stops placing themselves second. Now they find themselves caught in a difficult internal conflict. They want to move toward you, yet they don't want to begin something they're uncertain they can sustain. They want to offer a meaningful apology, yet they worry about making promises they might struggle to keep. They want to restore closeness, yet they understand that closeness requires effort, responsibility, and consistency. So they remain suspended between two opposing forces, between wanting and avoiding, between reaching forward and retreating backward, between the pull toward you and the familiar habit of staying distant. That's why their energy feels uneven, conflicted, and restless lately. Their heart points one way while their actions still move another. They imagine finding the courage to step forward. They imagine discovering exactly the right words. They imagine showing up as a stronger and better version of themselves. But imagining is easy. Living it is much harder. Living it requires something real. It demands repeated actions. It requires commitment over time. It asks for proof rather than promises. This is where fear tightens its grip most strongly because deep down they understand something important. Words alone won't be enough anymore. You're no longer waiting to be convinced by beautiful statements. You're watching for what remains consistent. You're paying attention to what lasts. You're looking for actions that continue long after the conversation ends. That doesn't mean your care disappeared. It simply means you became stronger. You learned how to sit with sadness without allowing it to define you. You faced disappointment honestly. You stopped avoiding difficult truths. You allowed reality to become clear. They're only beginning that same process now. Loss doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives softly. Sometimes it appears as emotional distance. Sometimes it reveals itself through subtle shifts in someone's energy. Sometimes it arrives as a feeling that something important is slowly slipping away. They feel that quiet truth now whenever they think about reaching out. They feel it whenever they picture you moving forward peacefully. They feel it whenever they imagine you building a life filled with clarity instead of uncertainty. That image unsettles them deeply, not because they wish anything bad for you, but because they realize they may no longer be central to the future they once assumed they'd remain part of. There's nothing they can do to easily stop that realization. They can't stay busy enough to avoid it forever. They can't distract themselves from it indefinitely. For perhaps the first time, they're confronting what fear has truly cost them. For a long time, they resisted their feelings for you. They resisted the responsibility that comes with emotional presence. They resisted vulnerability. They resisted openness. They resisted softness. Now all of that resistance has nowhere left to go. It's become pressure building inside them, and the pressure keeps growing. They're not only afraid of losing you, they're afraid of what losing you reveals about themselves. At a deeper level, they understand this was never simply about bad timing. It was fear. Fear of being fully seen. Fear of not being enough. Fear of making mistakes. Fear of loving deeply and failing. Fear of not knowing how to care for something meaningful without accidentally breaking it. Again and again, they revisit moments when they could have spoken. Moments when honesty was possible. Moments when courage was available. Moments when a different choice could have changed everything. Those moments seemed small at the time. Now they feel enormous. Now they carry weight. Now they return repeatedly. You didn't suddenly vanish from the connection. You slowly adjusted to what they consistently showed was available. You stopped carrying the entire emotional burden yourself. You stopped filling every silence with hope. You stopped sacrificing your own peace to keep the connection alive. Those changes happened gradually. There were no dramatic announcements, no major declarations, no final confrontation, just a series of small decisions that slowly moved you toward yourself again. They can see that now. They notice you no longer depend on them in the same way. They notice their moods no longer influence your choices as much. They notice their uncertainty no longer controls your emotional world. Yet what affects them most is your calmness. Calm often feels more final than anger. Anger still reaches outward. Anger still hopes to be heard. Anger still carries emotional attachment. Calm carries acceptance. Calm suggests reality has been acknowledged. Calm suggests someone may no longer be waiting for circumstances to change. They understand confusion. They understand mixed signals. They understand avoidance. But they have no map for someone who has become clear, steady, and secure. You're no longer waiting to be selected by someone else. You recognize your own worth now, and that changes everything. Their fear continues becoming more layered. They worry that coming forward may reveal they're still not ready. They worry they can't become the person you need. They worry that you understand them more honestly than they understand themselves. Standing in truth is difficult for someone who spent years hiding behind explanations. They want you to know their feelings were genuine. They want to explain the silence. They want to describe how overwhelmed they often felt. They want to tell you why they withdrew. But they're learning an important lesson. Arriving late doesn't erase the past. Good intentions don't undo hurt. Remorse doesn't automatically restore what was lost. What matters now is what happens next. What matters is whether they can finally meet you in the place where you've been trying to meet them. What matters is whether they can offer the consistency and presence they couldn't offer before. What matters is whether they're willing to do the internal work to become someone capable of showing up, not just once or twice, but repeatedly, over time, through difficulty. They feel the weight of all of this. They carry the heaviness of knowing they may have waited too long. They know that some doors, once closed, don't easily open again. They know that some opportunities don't come around twice. They know that you might choose to continue building your life without them. And while that knowledge is painful, it's also the first true thing they've allowed themselves to feel about this situation in a long time. The question isn't whether they still have feelings. The question is whether they finally have the courage to transform those feelings into action. The question is whether they're willing to be vulnerable in a way they've never been before. The question is whether they can accept that they may have lost something irreplaceable. And perhaps most importantly, the question is whether you've decided that their potential future readiness matters less to you than the present reality you've already experienced. You deserve honesty about where things actually stand. You deserve to know that beneath all the silence and distance and avoidance, they did care. They do care. But caring and being capable of showing up are two different things. You've already proven that you can be the person who shows up. The question now is whether they can finally do the same.